Hey guys, thanks for checking out this video. This is a follow-up to a live Zoom tutorial I did on hand sewing where we made a very simple face mask. The pattern I'm using today is called the Ally Mask. I got it from an organization called Proto Haven, which is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You can check them out right here. They're a DIY makerspace, so they teach people new skills and crafts. They provide the tools and the instruction, and then hopefully you leave with a new skill. So since I can't be in Pittsburgh, I am using their mask, and I very much thank them for making this available. The purpose of my workshop was to demonstrate basic hand sewing skills. So we're going to go through the running stitch, the backstitch, the double running stitch, and then I'm also including a ladder stitch because it's a really useful stitch, although it's a little more advanced. So at the end of this, we do make a face mask. Now, at the time of recording, March 2021, the current recommendations in the US are that double masking is more, protects you more than one mask. So follow the current guidance wherever you are. You could consider this to be a mask cover if that suits you. But whatever you're doing, please keep something on your face, keep washing your hands. We're in this for a little while longer, and wearing the mask is the least we can do. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please feel free to leave a comment. If you have questions about the mask itself, the folks at Proto Haven seem to be really great at getting back to you, so feel free to reach out to them there. And I think that's everything, so let's get started.
For the purposes of this tutorial, I will be using burlap, embroidery floss, needle, and scissors. You should be using regular fabric, needle, and thread. So the first thing you're going to do is take a length of thread off of your spool. A good rule of thumb is that your sewing length should be about 30 centimeters or 1 foot. So take double that off your spool because we're going to double it up once it's on the needle. So next you match up your ends, and the way I like to make a knot is I hold on to it, wrap it around my index finger, roll it off, and then that gives me a knot. But if you don't like that method, you can just do it the normal way by making a loop, bringing the end through that loop, and then I'll show you a trick. You can take your needle and guide that knot right to the end of your thread. And then make sure it's very tight. Now I'm making another knot because I'm using a very open weave. And again, you can use the needle to guide the second knot right on top of the first. But one knot will probably be fine for your regular fabric. The first stitch I'm going to show you is the running stitch, which is the most basic of stitches. So you bring your needle up, and then you go down a little distance away. My stitches here are larger than normal so that you can see them, but the longer the stitch, the weaker the stitching, the smaller the stitch, the stronger line you'll have. So the spaces between your stitches should be about equal to the stitches you're making because on the other side of the fabric you're getting the inverse line. The other thing with running stitch that you can do is you can load up a stitch. So rather than going up and down, you can do a few stitches on the needle like so and bring it through. It's a little bit quicker. There. So you've got a line of running stitches. The thing about this is that it's weak and can be pulled. If that happens, no worries, just flatten out your fabric again, and before you tie it off, make sure your fabric is flat. So here we have all these spaces. In order to make this stronger, I'm going to show you a double running stitch. And this, you might guess, is just filling in those gaps. So you can do this from either side of the fabric since they're going to match. If you want to be very precise, I would recommend doing one stitch at a time. However, you can also use that loading the stitches trick here. So if you go down and up, all from the same side of the fabric, you can do multiple stitches all in one go. When you're done with that stitch, you'll notice it looks the same on the front and the back. Now to finish this off, you'll make a knot. So to do that, you can pass your needle under a nearby stitch or under a few threads of your fabric. You want to make sure it's not going through to the other side, but a few threads should be fine. So you'll bring your needle through, and before you tighten it up, you'll take this loop that's created, pass your needle through, and pull it up tight. And that will make sure your knot is right up close to the back of your fabric. Do that one more time right in the exact same spot to create a double knot. You can snip the thread off quite close. Not quite at the end, but pretty close to the knot. And there you have the running stitch and the double running stitch. Some pros and cons. Obviously, this is a pretty easy stitch to do. It looks the same front and back. It is a little bit weaker, and if you pull on the stitch, it can gather the fabric. So those are just things to know when you're deciding which stitch to use. The next stitch I'm going to show you is a backstitch, which starts off very similarly to our running stitch. You bring your needle up, you go down one stitch away. The third step is exactly the same. You come up, and here's where it starts to differ. Rather than go forward, I'm going to go back to fill in this blank space, and I'm going to come out one blank space beyond that. So step 4 is to fill that in, and step 5, I'm coming up the length of one stitch away. And then I'm going to repeat that. So step 6 is you go down, you're filling in that stitch you left open, and you come up leaving a blank space. And you can do that all in one go rather than up and down, just from one side. So you get a continuous flowing motion to create that stitch. So the difference between these two stitches is you'll notice on the back of the back stitch, you have this double length stitch, and all of these overlap. Now the benefit to that is that if I pull on this, the only stitch that pulls is the last one I made, compared to the running stitch where all of it pulls up. So to finish this off, I'll make a knot on this side, and there you have the back stitch. Now some quick pros and cons. This is a bit of a stronger stitch because it doesn't all pull out. You can do the same area as a double running stitch all at the same time without going back. Cons, the sides don't look the same, so this isn't a good stitch to use if you're going to have a visible seam. And this does use a little bit more thread, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. The next stitch is called the ladder stitch. And I've already loaded up my needle. I'm using yarn here so that it's even more visible. So I'm coming up on one piece of fabric. I'm coming directly across and coming down on the second piece of fabric. Normally I would use this stitch on, say, the seam of a pillow that had been mostly sewn by machine and then just had this extra hole left where we turned it inside out and stuffed it. So for this tutorial, I'm using separate pieces so you can hopefully get an idea of the mechanics, but you can use this stitch in many different places. So now I've come up just one stitch up, and then I'm going to come directly across. So these should be parallel stitches. Coming down on the right side fabric. I'm leaving these stitches loose for the moment so that you can see why it's called the ladder stitch, but we'll tighten it up in a moment. So I'm coming up one stitch and directly across parallel. You could also compare this to maybe the way you could thread a pair of shoelaces, except with shoelaces you're going up one as you come across. This you're going fully parallel. So again, just directly across and through, and you can complete that motion in one step. Rather than going down and up, you can just bring it right across and come through. So before I tighten this up, I'm just going to simulate a seam much like in a pillow, which would have this sort of folded edge already completed. We'll do that on the other side, and where I'm making this fold is where the fabric is going to come together, because that's where my line of stitching is. So this isn't going to be quite as smooth since I'm using burlap and yarn. And normally I would have tightened this up a bit sooner, but I want you to be able to see how this brings the fabric together. So I'm trying to pull on it. It's not quite working, but that's not a big deal. I'll just go back down and tighten it individually. And as I tighten it up, the fabric comes together. You can see on the flip side, it just looks like a series of running stitches. So there we are. Continuing on as if I did have a sewn piece already, I'm going through the fold. Now it's still important to understand that I'm only going through one layer of fabric. I'm not piercing the fold itself. I'm just using the fold as a guide to keep my stitching line straight. This is a great stitch to know if you're ever working on something where you can't see the other side, like a pillow, or perhaps I've seen large scale uses of this on, say, like a theatrical set. So I'm just speeding this up so you don't have to watch every stitch, and I skipped the knot because the burlap was unraveling, but I want you to see on the other side. That's what it ends up looking like. Just basically a running stitch on the inside. So this is pretty invisible. It closes up a seam that isn't laid flat. It can be a little tricky to learn, so please ask questions if you need them. But once you get it, it can be incredibly useful. So now that you know how to sew, let's make a mask. You'll need a piece of fabric that's kind of fun looking. This one's from IKEA. Some sort of lining. This will be next to your face. I'm using this cotton muslin here. You'll need your Ally mask pattern, but just a note, I have removed the seam allowance, which I will explain in a moment. Something to mark your fabric with. I'm using a Sharpie so that you can see it on camera, but please never use a Sharpie on fabric. You'll need your fabric scissors, and if you have them, you could use pins to help you in this process. But if you don't have pins, we can make do without. This is a small project, so hopefully it will be fine. So I'm going to place my pattern on top of my lining fabric. Now here, if you had pins, you could pin the paper pattern right to the fabric so it doesn't shift around. But if you don't have pins, you can use anything kind of heavy, roll of tape, keep it in place. Scissors work great. You'll just have to draw around it, whatever you have. So again, I'm using this Sharpie and I'm going to draw around my pattern. Now, the pattern that the Proto Haven gives you includes the seam allowance, which is about 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter. I've removed it so that when I draw on the fabric, the line I'm drawing is the line I'm going to stitch on. Both methods are totally fine. So I've left this spot at the top, which is where we're going to turn it inside out. I'm going to draw a dotted line just so you can visualize it. However, that's not really necessary to do. Now when I go to cut this out, I need to add back in that seam allowance. The seam allowance is the extra fabric between the cut edge and where you're stitching. So just make sure to leave that. Do not cut on the line. Next, I'm going to cut out my fancy fabric. So I'm just lining this up. This was a scrap I had. Just make sure your right sides are facing together, meaning the side that's facing out when you are finished completely. And I'm going to cut this out so that both pieces of fabric match. And I will be sewing the line that is on my lining. Great job. So now that we have our pieces, we can start sewing this together. So again, make sure your right sides are facing each other. So your wrong side, or the side that will face on the inside, never to be seen again, is facing you at this moment. So you'll take some thread off your spool. Normally, again, you would use some sort of matching thread. I'm using blue here because I'm hoping it's visible. However, small thread and needle don't really show up too well on camera. If you need stitching help, please refer to the beginning of the video with individual stitching tips. So I've threaded my needle and I'm just going to tie a knot in the end, and I am ready to go. So we're going to sew this entire solid line. I wouldn't recommend trying to do it all with one piece of thread. I would just do this in sections. So with this first section, I'm going to use our double running stitch. So I'm using the loading technique here. Goes a little bit quicker. However, I have sped this up. I don't really sew this fast, and I would encourage you to take your time. I'm also making possibly slightly too big stitches here, just for time, but the smaller the stitches, the stronger this will be. So I flipped this over to the other side because my wonderful Sharpie line has made it difficult to see the stitches. And I'm just filling in so I get my double running stitch. Here I'm making that knot by bringing the needle underneath, bringing my needle through the loop, and tightening it up. 2 times for safety. And I will cut off the thread. And there you have it. Next, I'm going to use the backstitch for this next line, just so you can see them both in use. Something that can happen when you're sewing is that your thread, especially when it's doubled up like this, it can snag. One side can pull faster than the other, so just keep an eye on that. Check the other side of your work every once in a while. Make sure you're not getting any strange knots. If it keeps knotting up on every stitch, your thread is probably twisted, so something you can do is lift your whole piece into the air and let the weight of the needle hang down, and it will untwist your thread. If it keeps happening, I would recommend using shorter pieces of thread for your work until you get a little more comfortable, or perhaps just your thread has a twist in it that's going to keep doing that. So I'm tying it off, snip it off, and there we have our second line of stitching. I'm going to finish this solid line and come back. All right, I have finished sewing, and now we need to clip our corners, this is very important. This is the most important snip. So you just want to make a very small little snip. And I'm just pausing here to explain why we make that little snip, because once you turn this inside out, that little piece of fabric needs the room to spread outwards. So in this diagram, you can see it's an acute angle, but when it's opened up, it becomes a straight line. Don't go through the stitching, and on the corners, you're going to cut them off at about a 45-degree angle. This isn't completely necessary. The small clip in the middle is somewhat necessary, and what this does is when you go to turn this inside out, the corners will have less bulk in them, and that little clip at the acute angle will be able to open up so you can turn it inside out. So then go right ahead, stuff it all through that opening, and you can use your fingers or a pencil just to press out those corners. I'm using my little snips because I like a nice sharp corner, but I do recommend using caution. If you're using anything sharp, you don't want to explode any stitching you've done. There. So then you can flatten it out. If you have an iron, this is when I would recommend you iron it, but if you don't, it's fine. You can just do this with your fingers. So now we need to close up this opening. Now you could do this with your running stitch or even a back stitch if you wanted, but I'm going to use our ladder stitch here, so hopefully you can see what I meant when I talked about closing up a seam that was mostly done already. So to start off this stitch, I'm going to come up on the inside past the point of the opening, so I'm just burying that knot in the stitching I've already done. And then I'm going to travel along both sides of these folds to knit up my fabric. I'm sorry the video got a little blurry here, but hopefully this translates on camera. If not, you can go back to the burlap version and follow along with that. The ladder stitch is just a choice I made here. It's not necessary, and this is the hand sewing version versus the machine sewing version, where if I was machine sewing, I would just sew this up with a visible line. It's just key to note here what is visible and what is not. So all the stitching we did before this is on the inside. You won't see it. It doesn't have to be the prettiest thing. The thread doesn't have to match. But in this case, my thread might be showing, especially if I used a running stitch here, so you just want to keep that in mind with thread choice and with the amount of effort you put into your stitching. So then to tie off my knot here, I'm going to go through a stitch that was already done. I'm kind of opening it up so you can hopefully see, and I'm going right into the line between the fabric around an existing stitch so that that knot gets pulled down into the seam and will be as invisible as possible. Then again, I will snip off my thread. And there we have our closed up mask. So we are getting closer to the finished product. The next step is to create channels for the straps. So if you fold this in half, you can see these corners are where we are going to attach the straps. So I'm going to fold them in. This is a double fold, so it kind of creates a little bit of a flat tube. Let me get my thread ready. This is another time where if you have pins, it might be easier to pin this down, but it's such a tiny seam that it's almost just easier to hold it with your fingers while you sew. So here, I'll admit I'm actually using a new stitch called a whip stitch. I've buried the knot on the inside of that little fold, and now I'm just going to go through all of my layers of fabric. You could just pick up the lining fabric here, meaning you won't see these stitches on the outside, or you can go all the way through. A running stitch would be fine here. A back stitch, but in that case I would make sure my quote right side is on the right side of the fabric. But anything here, since you won't really see this doesn't need to be the prettiest stitching. And don't worry, this is sped up. I do not sew this fast unless I'm really in a hurry. But all you really need to do is make sure this is very secure. I'll knot it off and snip off my thread. So I will do this on the other side and meet you back here for the next step. So here I have both of my channels sewn up, and I just want to make sure that I can fit something in between there. This should be a tube. You should only have sewn the little straight side, not both corners. So next I'm going to fold this in half, and we're going to be closing up this line, which is the chin and mouth. So you have one of two options. One, you could use a ladder stitch to close this up, since you have a similar fold situation going on here. I'm going to use the running stitch. So first I'm placing my knot so that it's on the inside of the mask between the fabric, and then I will just proceed with my regular double running stitch. Once again, this stitch will be visible when I'm done with the mask, but I like that look. If you want it to be invisible, go ahead and use that ladder stitch. Your other option is that you could fold this right sides together, use your running or back stitch to close it up, and then turn it right side out again. When I'm done stitching this here, I'm going to make my knot on the inside, which protects the knot and makes it just a little bit prettier. I'm going to finish the other line of stitching and come back to do the straps. All right, here is my finished sewn mask. All that is left to do is add the straps. Here we have two pieces of jersey fabric or t-shirt material, which is a very comfortable option to go around your ears and sit there all day. I'm adding a safety pin to the end to assist with threading through, which I will do now. Once it's threaded through, you can remove the safety pin. Now the original Ally mask just has you tie knots in the ends, both ends of this strap, which keeps it from coming back through. So that's the purpose of that. So in that case, you would thread each strap through, tie knots on the ends, and you'd be done. But I like to provide options because I have a lot of hair and I find different styles work better for different styles, depending on how I'm wearing it. So if I put the safety pin back on and continue this strap through, then I like to tie the ends in one big loop. Now I like to put the ends together to tie the knot because it's a bit stronger, but I'm not tightening it quite yet. First, I'm going to try it on and make sure it fits and is comfortable. So that's how you would wear that mask with the straps out. However, because you can pull it through, you can kind of put it around your neck, bring it up around your ears. It's adjustable depending on what you need that day. Now the third option is two shorter straps to go around the ears. So I'm just cutting that so I have my two short straps. Again, I tie the knot with the ends together and I'm not tightening it up quite yet. I'm tying both sides so that I can try it on and see if I like that style. I'm not putting my face on camera here, but you'll just have to trust me that I'm trying it on and it looks great. There, so if I'm happy, I will tighten up the knots, make sure they're not going anywhere. try it on one more time just to make sure I didn't move the knots too much. And then I can snip off the extra fabric. Now, an optional step is you can bring that knot into the channel so that you don't have the knot placed behind your ear when you're wearing it. Again, totally optional, and I do find that the jersey fabric is more comfortable than other forms of elastic. So this isn't entirely necessary. However, good to know. And good to know if you have other masks that are uncomfortable, if you can just rotate that knot to the inside, you might have a better day.
All right, so there you have it, the Ally face mask. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I'll try and get back to you. Hopefully this was clear, but if not, you can let me know that as well. But thank you so much for coming to my thread talk.